Well, I noticed that John didn't mention my other books, and I think probably because one of them's on infant baptism. So that's okay. I've noticed Presbyterians are dominating this conference in speakers, but I'm the last one, I promise. Well, this afternoon, as John said, I want to speak on two individuals that really contributed to religious toleration in the colonies. One of those, and they lived about 100 years apart from one another. One of them was Francis Makemie, and the other, maybe more well known, is Samuel Davies. So for our purposes, what we'll do is we'll first look at Francis Makemie. I'll give you a little bit of biographical information about him, and then talk about the account with him and Lord Cornbury of New York, and then we'll look at Samuel Davies in Virginia. Well, Francis Makemie, again, there's debate how to say his name, Makemie or Makemie. We'll just go with Makemie for here. He was born to Scottish parents in Donegal, Ireland, in 1658. And just to put his birth in context, he was born shortly before the death of Samuel Rutherford, not too long after the Westminster Assembly adjourned, and around the same time that Oliver Cromwell died. So born very, very late in the 17th century. He was educated at the University of Glasgow in Scotland in 1676, and one of the reasons that he went to Glasgow as opposed to, say, Trinity College in Dublin was because it was closed off to dissenters during that time period. The only physical description we have of Makemie is that he was blue-eyed, brown-haired, with a fair complexion. Some of us have that fair complexion still. Further, it went on to say he had an intellectual forehead and dignified mien of a true Irish gentleman. So that was the only description of Makemie. Makemie, more than likely, as a young man living in Ulster, witnessed the persecution that followed the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660. And we know that he had siblings, but he was the only one, it seems, that ventured over to the colonies. He made his way to the colonies in 1683, and he ministered in Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, and the colony of Barbados. He did attempt to get to South Carolina, but was providentially hindered, and he ended up settling in Accomack County in Virginia. And as often the case with dissenting ministers, he took up a trade on the side to bring in additional income. And in the 1690s, we see Makemie going back and forth from Virginia to the colony of Barbados. Makemie was a defender of Reformed orthodoxy, as seen in a written debate that he had with a Quaker by the name of George Keith. He also wrote on Christian unity between Presbyterians and Anglicans. Of course, not downplaying the differences that exist, but arguing essentially that there is a lot of substantial unity between the two traditions. He also wrote on secular matters. He defended the development of towns and greater communal life at a time when the colony of Virginia was much more rural and separated. But perhaps Makemie's biggest contribution to American Presbyterianism, Zach kind of mentioned this briefly, was his involvement in establishing the first presbytery. And again, presbytery is the regional court of the church in Presbyterian polity. Its members are the ministers and the churches. So he was involved in establishing the first American presbytery in 1706, right down the road in Philadelphia. And he was also credited with preaching the first Presbyterian sermon in the city of Philadelphia in 1692. Now, this presbytery in Philadelphia, it didn't include all the Presbyterian ministers in the colonies. It mainly was centered in Maryland, Delaware, and in in Pennsylvania. Now, the occasion that's relevant for our discussion here took place in the colony of New York in 1707. It was that year that Makemie and one of his colleagues, John Hampton, were traveling up to Boston to recruit more ministers to the Presbyterian Church. But when he made it to New York, Makemie encountered trouble with the royal governor there, Edward Hyde. Edward Hyde was the royal governor of New York and New Jersey from 1702 to 1709. He's also known in history as Lord Cornbury, and many things you can say about Lord Cornbury from history, but he is known to be a very corrupt man. Now, religious establishment took hold in New York after the Glorious Revolution with the support of the royal governors. And even though they sought to influence the colony, they were never close to reflecting the majority of the people in the colony. One observer at the time noted that at the time of establishment, the Church of England in New York could barely claim 10 members who were not government officials. One historian noted that, quote, an aggressive minority with connections to the mother country was attempting to create a fully ordered, hierarchical, and government-supported church without extensive precedent or material resources. And interestingly enough, New York really had a soft Anglican establishment with some counties having the establishment and some not having it. It was a bit of an oddity. One historian wrote that the counties in New York with religious establishment huddled around the center of English power in New York City. Other counties with extensive Dutch settlements did not have an established Anglican church, and many Dutch Reformed churches in certain areas existed as a de facto established church with little Anglican opposition. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel actually aided Anglican establishment starting in 1701, and Edward Hyde, or Lord Cornbury, sought to impose strong Anglican establishment on the colony. So as royal governor, Cornbury was responsible for the propagation of the gospel in his colonies, and he personally made it his mission to disrupt dissenting ministers and bring them into the Anglican fold. So both Makemie and his colleague were invited to have dinner with the governor when they arrived in New York. And during that dinner, Makemie requested to preach. He requested permission to preach in some of the Dutch and French Reformed churches in the colony. Well, Cornbury refused that permission. But that didn't stop Makemie. He ended up preaching anyway. He preached on January 19th, 1707 in the home of a man named William Jackson, and he preached with the doors open in the most public manner that he could. And Lord Cornbury responded by having both Makemie and Hampton arrested and charged them with preaching without a proper license. Well, Makemie didn't believe he had done anything wrong because he had acquired a dissenter's license from the British officials. Even though the license wasn't from the colony of New York, it was from English officials and thus should have been valid throughout all of the British colonies. Well, Cornbury understood that dissenters were to come to him to receive a license in order to preach in New York or New Jersey. And there's actually an account of this recorded. You could find it presumably online. It's called A Narrative of a New and Unusual American Imprisonment. It's said to be written by Makemie, although he nowhere claimed authorship, but it is included in his works. So as mentioned, Cornbury claimed that Makemie and Hampton were not allowed to preach in his colony before they were granted a license by him. And Makemie, however, responded, claiming that they had the liberty to preach from an act of Parliament in the first year of the reign of King William and Queen Mary. And of course, that's a reference to the 1689 Act of Toleration. Well, Cornbury responded that the Act of Toleration did not apply to the colonies. And that's going to come up, you'll see that come up often, and it also comes up with Samuel Davies in Virginia, this argument that the Act of Toleration actually didn't apply to the colonies. Well, Makemie pushed back and argued that the act was not for England alone, but was applicable to all the queens, and in that time it was Queen Anne, all the queen's plantations. Makemie had certificates from Barbados, Virginia, and Maryland, which he produced. And his point was that if the act was simply local, then these certificates wouldn't exist. The fact that they existed demonstrated that the act was applied and practiced in the colonies. Now, one of the major issues for Makemie was his insistence that Cornbury was applying the law arbitrarily. Not only were the Presbyterians abiding by the established rules, but the doctrine they preached was not that different from the Anglican establishment. And it makes sense. Makemie wrote a book arguing that. Furthermore, while Cornbury was being strict with Makemie, he also tolerated Jews, Quakers, and other groups. Makemie went on to say this. He said, quote, "And it will be unaccountable to England to hear that Jews who openly blaspheme the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and disown the whole Christian religion, Quakers who disown the fundamental doctrines of the Church of England in both sacraments, Lutherans and all others are tolerated in your lordship's government, and only we have complied and are still ready to comply with the act of toleration." Cornbury demanded that Makemie not preach again in the places under his jurisdiction, and Makemie refused. Makemie was then put in jail where he stayed for 6 weeks. And he went on to face trial later, and more than likely, Cornbury maybe hoped that Makemie wouldn't come back and maybe he could just sweep this under the rug. Maybe he hoped that Makemie wouldn't make the trip back to New York. However, Makemie would not go down so easily. And I'd like to think that perhaps it was the Scots-Irish fight in him, the stubbornness that he would not back down. He believed the rights of all dissenters were at stake, not just for those in New York, but also for the other colonies as well. At the same time, it wasn't easy for Makemie to make the trip. In a day without modern transportation, the trip from Virginia to New York was hard. According to Makemie, it took about a 400-mile journey to get there. Yet this leading Presbyterian was in attendance when the Supreme Court of New York in 1707 took up his case, and he was defended by 3 lawyers in the colony. He was eventually acquitted of the charges, but nonetheless was forced by the court to pay all the costs, including the costs of the prosecution. How nice. After this, Cornbury wrote a defense of his actions, and he mentioned Makemie. And he described the Irish Presbyterian as this, quote, "Makemie was a jack of all trades, preacher, doctor of physic, a merchant, an attorney or counselor at law, and which is worst of all, and this is my favorite, a disturber of governments." Now, one historian has said that although Makemie was concerned for the dissenters and advocated for religious toleration by the Anglican establishment, it'd be too much to claim that he was an advocate for religious liberty in the later Jeffersonian sense. He certainly would not have advocated for religious liberty in the modern sense, where we allow all kinds of religions other than Protestantism to hold equal weight in society. And he certainly wouldn't have advocated for some kind of separation between religion and the state. In other words, Makemie would have certainly been an advocate for mainstream Protestants to have the freedom to preach and gather for worship, but he would not have been in favor of the religious pluralism that we have today, or advocating for some kind of religious neutrality in the public square. In fact, in his sermon that he preached in New York, which was the occasion for his arrest by Cornbury, he spoke of the importance of the civil magistrate in promoting regularity and order in the lives of Christians. Makemie said that the magistrate and the ministers should work together for the promotion of a well-ordered life, and for them to execute penal laws against scandalous offenders and visible immorality. Makemie argued that as an ordinance of God, the magistrate is to punish by the sword what the church has censured by the word. In order for the civil ruler to faithfully carry out God's wrath against a wrongdoer, Makemie says there has to be penal laws against vice and immorality, otherwise no Christian state would be safe. Makemie believed that if the civil magistrate was zealous in executing the godly laws that made up the English Constitution in all the dominions of the kingdom, then it would prevent innumerable immoralities such as drunkenness, cursing, whoredom, and the profanation of the Lord's day. Makemie, of course, recognized that true regeneration, true conversion only comes by the Holy Spirit through his word. But he also appreciated the importance of a moral order. And he thought the civil magistrate was ordained by God to maintain that order. He preached this. He said, quote, "Would to God such as are in authority, invested with the sword of justice, were exercising it boldly and faithfully against sin and all immoralities in life and conversation, and that impartially, according to their oaths and office." Now that's Francis Makemie. Let's fast forward a few years later. Samuel Davies was born roughly 15 years after the death of Makemie on November 3rd, 1723. And he was born in the colonies. He was born in Newcastle, Delaware. Davies' parents were of Welsh ancestry, and they found themselves in the Presbyterian Church partly due to Samuel's mother, Martha Davies, and her dislike for her Baptist pastor. So, sorry, Baptists. The family found themselves in the Welsh Tract Presbyterian Church, about 6 miles from the Davies home. And Davies was converted in 1736 under the preaching of the Scots-Irish Presbyterian minister Gilbert Tennent. He eventually made his way down to Virginia in 1748 at a time when the colony did not have a very high view of New Side Presbyterian ministers. Now, Zach mentioned the New Side, Old Side. It's a reference to that debate among Presbyterian ministers. It was much broader than the Presbyterians. You think of the Old Lights and the New Lights. But the New Side ministers were more friendly toward the revivals and the itinerant preachers. The Old Side Presbyterians tended to be more reserved and not like the itinerant preachers stepping into places where there were already established churches. It's a much broader debate than just whether we like revival or not. But Davies was a New Side Presbyterian minister. He inherited a vast amount of land to preach, and he petitioned the governor of Virginia for 4 meeting houses, 3 of which were in Hanover County, Virginia, and then 1 in Henrico County, Virginia. After a fellow Presbyterian minister, John Rogers, his petition was rejected by the governor, Davies actually inherited more meeting houses. And he became so popular that many traveled 30 to 40 miles just to listen to him preach. And we know that at the well-known Polgreen Church over in Hanover County, a young Patrick Henry would often attend with his mother to listen to the great Davies preach. Now, in the colony of Virginia, religious toleration was virtually unknown prior to 1688. In the early 17th century, a person who was found in Virginia absent from divine service, absent from worship, without a reasonable excuse, he was fined a pound of tobacco. If he was absent for an entire month, it was 55 pounds of tobacco. So the message was, don't miss service. In 1643, in order to preserve the purity of doctrine, it was enacted that all ministers should conform to the orders and doctrine of the Church of England, and all others were not permitted to teach, either publicly or privately. After the interregnum in England, which was a brief reprieve for the dissenters in Virginia, and the monarchy was reestablished, the colony of Virginia then only allowed men to minister who received ordination from a bishop in England. The Act of Toleration, mentioned a minute ago, was passed by the British Parliament in 1689, but its provisions were unknown in Virginia until 10 years later when a man named Francis Makemie went to apply for a license. In colonial Virginia, as I said, parish attendance was compulsory, yet neither clergy nor citizen overall showed concern for Christian living. The bar was set so low that Governor Gooch could write a letter excusing a minister of the established church for his involvement in quarreling because he was ministering in a place that was known to enjoy, quote, drinking and boxing. So you get a pass. In 1738, Governor Gooch entered into an agreement with the Presbyterian Synod of Philadelphia. Now, just so you know, the synod at that time was the highest governing body in the Presbyterian Church. You obviously had the local court, which was the sessions or the elders. You had the presbytery, which was the regional group of elders, and then the synod was all the elders of all the churches in the colonies at that point. So it was the highest governing body in the Presbyterian Church at that time. Governor Gooch entered into an agreement with them, allowing the Presbyterian immigrants to occupy the frontier portions of the colony and enjoy the benefits of the Act of Toleration. As a result, many of the Presbyterians flooded into the Blue Ridge, but perhaps the most important area of Presbyterian influence for our purposes was in Hanover. William Robinson, an English Presbyterian, began his work in Hanover, and then Davies came after him and really took over and really picked up where Robinson left off. Davies helped establish the Hanover Presbytery, which Zach mentioned, and Hanover Presbytery really became the first presbytery of the South that was connected to a synod. And I have to qualify that because there was an independent presbytery in Charleston, South Carolina, earlier than Hanover, but it was independent. It wasn't connected to a higher governing body. Hanover was the first connected to a higher governing body, and really the origins of the Southern Presbyterian Church in Hanover. It was the dissatisfaction with the established church coupled with the preaching of Samuel Davies that drove many to the Presbyterian meeting houses. And when Davies was asked why there were many coming from the Anglican Church to his services, this is what Davies said. He said, quote, "I am persuaded there would have been but few dissenters in these parts of Virginia. For as I observed, their first objections were not against the peculiar rites and ceremonies of the church, much less against her excellent articles, but against the general strain of the doctrines delivered from the pulpit, in which these articles," meaning the 39 articles, "either were opposed or not mentioned at all." So Davies claimed that many of the churches in Virginia in the established church were actually either not mentioning their own theological standards or opposing them in the churches in Virginia. So Davies acquired the appropriate licenses, but the fact that he was so successful really didn't benefit him in the colony. In fact, the commissary in Virginia, which was an official that was appointed to exercise ecclesiastical oversight for the established church, he wrote the Bishop of London in 1752, and he said that everything was fine in the colony of Virginia until Davies arrived. Many of the Anglican clergy began to complain, and their complaints really centered on a few questions. First, it was the question of whether the New Side Presbyterian ministers actually had a legal right to preach since they were not connected with the Synod of Philadelphia. In 1741, there was a schism between the Old Side, New Side Presbyterians, and there was a new synod formed, the Synod of New York, which was really a New Side Synod, and then the Synod of Philadelphia remained the Old Side Synod. So the argument was really, are they even legitimately Presbyterian? They're not connected with the Synod of Philadelphia. It's really a slight against New Side ministers. But the second question was, they asked whether or not the Act of Toleration applied to the colonies. Does that sound familiar? It's the same question that was asked when Makemie was trying to preach. Now, the great Virginia Presbyterian John Holt Rice, Zach mentioned him a moment ago, he actually wrote a biography of Samuel Davies, and he gave us a really good account of Davies defending the cause for dissenters, and really emphasized Davies' brilliant knowledge of the law. So he's a Presbyterian minister, but he was well grounded in the laws of the colony. Listen, let me read you a portion of what Holt Rice said about Davies. He says, quote, "On one occasion, by special permission, Davies spoke for himself, Captain John Morton of Prince Edward County accompanied him at this time to Williamsburg. The circumstances of the case were often detailed by him with great satisfaction. The Attorney General was Peyton Randolph. He took the position, Randolph, that the Act of Toleration did not extend to the colony of Virginia, and delivered a speech of great legal learning. When Davies rose to reply, there was a general titter throughout the court. His very first remark, however, discovered so intimate an acquaintance with the law on that subject that marks of surprise were manifest on every countenance. In a short time, the lawyers began to whisper, "The Attorney General has met his match today, at any rate." The position taken by Davies was, if the Act of Toleration did not extend to the colony of Virginia, then neither did the Act of Uniformity. This was illustrated with a force, an ingenuity, and knowledge of law perfectly astonishing and completely victorious. The general sentiment among the members of the bar, as expressed in the hearing of Captain Morton, was, "There is a most capital lawyer spoiled." This display of talents called forth universal admiration, and Davies was treated in Williamsburg with very great attention. So Davies' argument was really that the government cannot hold two things that were mutually incompatible. If the Act of Toleration did not apply to the colonies, Davies said, then the Act of Uniformity could not apply. The fact of the matter was that the council utilized the Act of Toleration to their benefit. Davies brought out their inconsistencies in a work, you could find it online, entitled Appendix Proving the Right of the Synod of New York to the Religious Liberties and Immunities Allowed to the Protestant Dissenters. And one of his more forceful arguments in this work was that if the Act of Toleration did not extend to the colonies, then dissenting ministers could not be held culpable under its requirements. Davies' point was that there was no law in Virginia on the books that required dissenting ministers to take oaths, to record their meeting houses, and to subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. Those requirements were all stipulated in the Act of Toleration itself. Therefore, Davies argued, if the Act of Toleration did not extend to the colonies, then dissenting ministers should not be forced to submit to its regulations or be punished under its provisions. That was his argument. Davies claimed that this wasn't true, and what the New Side men preached was in substance the 39 Articles. You can see some of these arguments against the New Side men were really misrepresentations of their beliefs. And it's clear that the government in Virginia really had a prejudice or disdain for the New Side ministers. And we see this because there were also Old Side Presbyterian ministers in the colony. One in particular was a man named John Thompson, who was not treated as roughly as the New Side ministers were. In fact, the Old Side Presbyterians utilized that to their benefit against the New Side ministers in Virginia. Yet everywhere Davies went, even when he went to secure funds for the college in New Jersey over in England, he was advocating for the religious dissenters in the colonies. Now, while there was never a formal ruling in favor of the New Side Presbyterians, efforts to silence them were essentially abandoned in Virginia in 1759. And that doesn't mean that all forms of religious persecution or denominational persecution ceased. Part of the reason the New Side men gained respectability was that the Anglicans turned their sights on the Baptists. Again, sorry Baptists. But it was a victory for religious toleration to some extent. And one of the reasons also that Davies gained respect was because he was a strong advocate for the British during the French and Indian War. In fact, one historian noted that because of Davies' patriotic sermons, he became one of the best recruiting officers in the Virginia colony. So he was encouraging men to sign up to go to war, and that's all they needed was Davies' sermons to get men riled up. Davies had much to say about the war, including about a prominent colonel at the time by the name of George Washington. Davies preached to the Virginia Regiment of Volunteers in Hanover County on August 17, 1755. Listen to what he said prophetically, really, about Colonel Washington. He said, quote, "As a remarkable instance of this, I may point out to the public that heroic youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country." Talk about prophetic, 20 years before the War for Independence. Davies died after serving for less than 2 years as president of the College of Princeton University, at the time College of New Jersey, on February 4th, 1761. And if you want to feel bad about how much you've accomplished in your life, he died at 37 years old. A lot accomplished in such a short time. Now, there's no doubt that Davies would not have supported the religious pluralism that we know today. He certainly wanted religious toleration and freedom for Protestants in the colonies, but his outlook was that the colonies would continue to have a strong Protestant influence. One can see this in his concern during the French and Indian War and his advocacy for Protestant patriots to take up the cause and fight against the French Catholic tyranny. In his sermon on religion and patriotism in 1755, Davies said this, quote, "God has distinguished us with a religion from heaven, and hitherto we have enjoyed the quiet and unrestrained exercise of it. He has condescended to be a God to our nation, and to honor our cities with his gracious presence and the institutions of his worship, the means to make us wise, good, and happy. But now these most invaluable blessings lie at stake. Shall we tamely submit to idolatry and religious tyranny? No, God forbid. Let us play the men, since we take up arms for our people and the cities of our God." Davies believed that in the French and Indian War, the colonies were fighting for their liberties, and one of the liberties that they were fighting for was the Protestant religion. In the same sermon he preached, he said this, quote, "These are the blessings you contend for. All these will be torn from your grasp if these colonies should become a province of France. And Virginians, Britons, Christians, Protestants, if these names have any impact or energy, will you not strike home in such a cause?" Listen, it's important to understand Davies in this context. He was fighting for a religious toleration for fellow Protestants. He certainly wouldn't have been an advocate for some form of religious neutrality in the public square. He recognized the importance of God's law being recognized in society. In one of his sermons, he said this, quote, "Nothing tends more to the advantage of civil society than to have good laws established, according to which mankind are to conduct themselves, and according to which their rulers will deal with them. Now the supreme and universal king has enacted and published the best laws for the government of the moral world and of the human race in particular." Now Davies' efforts for religious toleration for dissenting Protestants bore fruit in securing religious freedom in Virginia. Later, after his death, his presbytery, the Hanover Presbytery, had a part to play in advocating for religious freedom for all men. Men like William Graham, who Zach mentioned earlier, were involved in this. John Blair Smith was another. Well, in June of 1776, the Virginia General Assembly passed a Declaration of Rights recognizing freedom for all, religious freedom for all men. Now, this didn't end establishment in Virginia. That came later in 1786. But since the Declaration of Rights didn't end, technically, Anglican establishment, petitions poured into the Virginia legislature from dissenting ministers and ecclesial bodies. Davies' own presbytery, the Hanover Presbytery, petitioned the legislature to repeal all laws and taxes supporting, quote, any church. Hanover's petition, dated October 24, 1776, argued that the tax supporting the established church was a violation of conscience and natural rights, especially, and this is kind of a jab, especially since the Episcopalians were not doing most of the ministerial work in the frontier counties. We're doing all the work. Why are they getting all the benefit? The presbytery went on to say, quote, "When our blessed Savior declares his kingdom is not of this world, he renounces all dependence on state power." The petition continued, quote, "We are persuaded that if mankind were left in the quiet possession of their unalienable religious privileges, Christianity, as in the days of the apostles, would continue to prevail and flourish in the greatest purity." The presbytery said, quote, "The only proper objects of civil government are the happiness and protection of men in the present state of existence, the security of the life, liberty, and property of the citizens, and to restrain the vicious and encourage the virtuous by wholesome laws equally extending to every individual." And the presbytery even appointed a minister, Reverend Caleb Wallace, who was very significant in Kentucky, to lobby for 2 months the Virginia General Assembly as they discussed this. Now, as the legislature went on to debate how church and state relations would function in Virginia in its future, the Hanover Presbytery remained involved in the process. The question of general assessment came up. Zach mentioned that a little bit, where citizens would be taxed and get to determine which church to support with their taxes. The presbytery sent a number of memorials to the legislature sharing their thoughts. They sent a memorial on June 3rd, 1777, which repeated some of the content that I just mentioned in the previous one, to argue against general assessment. The memorial said, quote, "Neither does the Church of Christ stand in need of a general assessment for its support, and most certain we are that it would be of no advantage but an injury to the society to which we belong." However, it's a bit more complicated than this. In the fall of 1779, a Presbyterian elder by the name of James Henry, he was a delegate. He was from Eastern Shore. He introduced a bill concerning religion into the Virginia legislature. It was borrowing from Article 38 of South Carolina's 1778 Constitution. And this bill would have made Christianity the established religion of Virginia, and would have taxed citizens for the church of their choice. For the churches to be established and incorporated, though, they would have had to subscribe to 5 theological articles according to this bill. First, this is a quote, "that there is one eternal God in a future state of rewards and punishments. Secondly, that God is publicly to be worshipped. Thirdly, that the Christian religion is the true religion. Fourthly, that the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament are of divine inspiration and are the only rule of faith. Fifthly, that it is the duty of every man when thereunto called by those who govern to bear witness to the truth." And sadly, this act did not pass the assembly. But what we see here is that there seems to have been some disagreement among the Presbyterians as to what kind of plan Virginia should adopt regarding taxing citizens to support the church. Some of the Presbyterians in the Hanover Presbytery even supported Patrick Henry's general assessment bill in the 1780s, which would have provided support for ministers of all denominations in Virginia. One scholar wrote that Henry and his supporters believed that the state had an interest in religion. A Republican state, the scholar said, required public virtue. Virtue was largely derived from religion, and thus the state had an interest in aiding the churches in their task of religious training. And while the dissenting clergy, all of them virtually, were against Henry's bill, the Presbyterians, however, seemed to be internally torn on this issue. In fact, James Madison noted in April of 1785, he said this, he said, quote, "The clergy of other sects, besides Episcopalians, were generally against Henry's assessment bill, except the Presbyterians, who seemed as ready to set up the establishment, which is to take them in as they were to pull down that which shut them out. I do not know a more shameful contrast," Madison said, "than might be formed between their memorials on the latter and former occasions." And that contrast that Madison was speaking about were two memorials that the Hanover Presbytery sent up. One in May of 1784 that was opposing general assessment, Henry's bill, and then one in October of 1784 that was supporting Patrick Henry's general assessment bill. Now, most scholars assert that the reason the Presbytery changed its position in October of 1784 was because they thought Henry's bill was bound to pass, and they wanted to influence the bill. The October 1784 memorial from Hanover said this, quote, "We wish it to be done on the most liberal plan." Leading up to this request, the memorial said, quote, "It is wise policy in legislators to seek religion's alliance and solicit its aid in a civil view because of its happy influence upon the morality of its citizens and its tendency to preserve the veneration of an oath or an appeal to heaven, which is the cement of social union." The memorial said, quote, "that upon this principle alone, that religion aids morality and social union, does a legislative body have a right to interfere in religion at all, and this interference ought only to extend to the preserving of the public worship of the deity and the supporting of institutions for incalculating the great fundamental principles of all religion, without which society could not easily exist," end quote. However, even if the Presbytery as a whole supported Henry in this view, in this October 1784 memorial, if they just supported it for pragmatic reasons, there is evidence to suggest that certain members of the Presbytery believed in principle that establishment would be beneficial to a state. The Presbytery ended up opposing general assessment in May of 1785, but again, it seems that some of the Virginia Presbyterians actually supported some kind of tax provision for clergy of all denominations. Yet regardless of the question of establishment, it would have been difficult to find any who disagreed with the idea that society should be governed, or society and government should be greatly influenced by Protestantism. Whether or not the state had established churches, it was assumed that Protestant principles, even Christian policies, would govern the state. Just one extreme example of this, I think, in Virginia is in a November 1786 bill written by Thomas Jefferson and introduced by James Madison. The bill was entitled, quote, "A bill for punishing disturbers of religious worship and Sabbath breakers." Among other things, the bill prohibited citizens from working on Sunday. Wish we could get some more Christians to. The bill went on to say this, quote, "If any person on Sunday shall himself be found laboring at his own or any other trade or calling, or shall employ his apprentices, servants, or slaves in labor, or other business, except it be in the ordinary household offices of daily necessity, or other work of necessity or charity, he shall forfeit the sum of 10 shillings for every such offense." Because I think if someone like Thomas Jefferson saw the importance of religious practice being codified into law, how much more so the average Christian at the time in Virginia? So we kind of went beyond Davies and Makemie, but just to conclude here, Presbyterian ministers like Makemie and Davies contributed to what has been accepted as a fundamental right of Americans, that we should be able to worship God according to the dictates of our conscience. Yet even so, we see that they would have not readily accepted the concept of religious neutrality or religious pluralism in the public sphere. That's because they believed to have a well-ordered society, there had to be something that sustained or supported that society, truth that was shared in common by its people. And as faithful Protestants, they understood that Christianity, in particular Protestant Christianity, was what the majority at the time shared in common, either by true faith or by culture, and that would greatly bless the country. Thank you.